Hello everyone, my name is Luke Fenton-Glynn and I'm going to be taking over the lecturing of this module, Critical Thinking, for the remainder of the semester. So I'll be picking up from where Ewan left off. So obviously you've been introduced to the notion of an argument and its structure, and also to the idea that in evaluating arguments we want to do two things. We want to firstly evaluate whether the premises are true, and secondly whether the premises support the conclusion. So let me just show my slides here. So as I just said, in evaluating arguments, we typically care about two things: the truth of the premises, and also to whether and to what extent the premises support the conclusion. So you've already looked to some extent at two, and we'll be returning to this again later in the semester. But for this lecture, we're going to be focusing on one, the truth of the premises of the argument. Now, to simplify things a bit, for now we'll be focusing on premises that are straightforwardly true or false. So a premise, just like a conclusion, is a sentence, and we might evaluate whether they're true or false. That seems like a relevant thing to do in assessing the quality of an argument. So examples of sentences that might possibly figure as premises in arguments that seem to be straightforwardly true or false are sentences like Tokyo is the capital of Japan, straightforwardly true. Secondly, 10 plus 12 is equal to 20. That seems to be straightforwardly false. Thirdly, there are more than 7.9 billion people on Earth. That's a sentence, I take it, that either is true or it's false. That is, it has a determinate truth value, even though it might be that I don't happen to know whether it's true or false. So, in fact, I don't know whether it's true or false, but presumably there's an objective fact of the matter, which I could find out by acquiring more evidence. Not all sentences are like this, right? So there are sentences that one might express that, at least arguably, are not straightforwardly true or false, don't have a straightforwardly have a truth value. So things like Vegemite is delicious, lying is wrong, there are 23 deserts in the world. So for different reasons, it might be argued that none of these has a truth value. So Vegemite is delicious, you might argue, is something like the expression of a personal preference rather than an objective matter of fact. Some moral philosophers, this is more controversial, some moral philosophers have claimed that moral claims like lying is wrong are rather like sentences like Vegemite is delicious. They're not expressing an objective truth, but rather maybe expressing a fact about one's own moral preferences or one's own moral system. It's controversial, and for that reason we'll for the time being avoid it in favour of less controversial cases. There are 23 deserts in the world. This, for quite a different reason, might be thought to lack a determinate truth value of true or false. So in particular in this case it seems maybe vague. It's not clear how one goes about counting deserts, where one desert ends and another begins, and for that reason you might think that a sentence like that doesn't have a determinate truth value. So again, this is another sort of sentence that we'll steer clear of for now, just for simplicity. So as I mentioned, some sentences that we probably believe do have determinate truth values, like there are more than 7.9 billion people on Earth, are sentences that I might not know, maybe you don't know, but it seems that in these cases, a reasonable person, and I guess in all cases where a sentence is one that has a truth value, it's plausible that a reasonable person will have a degree of confidence in the truth of that sentence that's determined by her degree of evidence, right? So it's sort of proportional to the degree of evidence that you have for the sentence. So if I have excellent evidence that the sentence is true, then it seems reasonable for me to have a high degree of confidence in the truth of the sentence. If I have poor evidence, then my confidence might be lower. And if I have excellent evidence that the sentence is false, then correspondingly, I might have a high degree of confidence that the sentence is not true. Okay, so consider an argument that employs a sentence that is presumably either true or false, but where it's not clear to me whether it's true or false. That is, I'm not sure, I don't necessarily have the evidence. So here goes. A population of more than 7.9 billion people on Earth is incompatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The Earth has a population of more than 7.9 billion people. Therefore, global warming won't be limited to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So here is an argument. I've highlighted the premises, the first and the second sentence, in blue, and the conclusion in red, just to distinguish. Now, of course, when thinking about this argument, it would be reasonable to think about whether the premises support the conclusion. It's quite plausible that the premises do support the conclusion. So we might then think about the truth or falsity of the premises. Now, both premises, both sentences here, we need to think carefully about. We're going to focus on the second sentence. The Earth has a population of more than 7.9 billion people, the example we used before. Now, okay, so at the moment, I don't know, like I don't have great evidence either way, so I don't have a high degree of confidence either that premise is true or that it's false. But it's worth noting that to some extent at least, the evidence that I have for a premise like this is under my control, right? So although I might not have great evidence now, presumably I could go out and collect evidence. I could increase the quality of my evidence, and that could help me evaluate the truth or falsity of the premise. Now, in order to think a bit more about what sorts of evidence we might acquire for premises, the truth or falsity of premises, it's going to be sort of helpful to sort of categorize some different grounds on which we might believe them. And so one ground might be just that the premise is self-evident, right? So this is presumably only going to apply to a certain select few sorts of premise that we might come across. So maybe logical truths, mathematical truths, things like all bachelors are unmarried. That's arguably a logical truth, right? So it's just part of the definition of a bachelor that a bachelor is an unmarried man. So it's a sort of definitional truth. And consequently, it carries a self-evidence. As long as I understand the meaning of the word bachelor and so on, then I can see right away that has to be true. And so I don't require any further evidence. That's the point of saying it's self-evident. And maybe mathematical truths like 2 + 2 = 4. So long as I understand the principles of basic mathematics, then it seems that should be pretty much self-evident to me, that I don't require any further evidence. So some premises might be like that. If we're lucky, we might have a premise like that where it's just self-evidently true or false for logical or mathematical reasons. So we can be sure of it, even though, even without doing any further research. But obviously a lot of premises won't be like that. They won't be self-evident. They will require further evidence, And one important class of evidence is empirical evidence, the sort of evidence that a scientist might come up with. So empirical evidence might take the form of things like observation, surveys, experiments. So scientists do these sorts of things when they want to find out stuff about the world. So the example that I used before, the population of the Earth is more than 7.9 billion people. That seems like something that would require empirical evidence. So we could engage in some population statistics and some surveying and so on to figure out whether that one's true. The Murray River is the longest in Australia. Again, that seems to be something. It's not self-evident, but it could be figured out by suitable empirical investigation. So someone could go out and measure the length of the Murray River. A third sort of evidence that we might have, or at least seek to acquire for a premise, is testimonial evidence. Evidence that is based on the sort of the word, the say-so of somebody else, hopefully an expert, and this is something that we'll come back to in the next section. For instance, a teacher, they might be an expert. An encyclopedia is a sort of form of written expertise. Hopefully it's written by experts, if it's a good one. Or maybe a journalist in certain circumstances. They might be worth listening to. So sources of testimonial evidence. So, for instance, I might be interested in what a journalist has to say about the war in Ukraine, right? So that might tell me certain information about what's going on there that I don't immediately have access to. So we'll return to the nature of testimonial evidence in the next section. But one thing that's worth commenting on is that actually, often, maybe always, in cases where we have testimonial evidence, we could possibly have that evidence in some other way, right? So often I believe things on testimonial grounds that I could have believed on more direct empirical grounds. That is to say, I could have got the evidence myself directly by observation, surveys, experiments, and so on. But in fact, I actually just relied on someone else to do this work and tell me about it. So, for instance, the Murray River is the longest in Australia. I guess I could have found that out myself by measuring it and maybe measuring all the other rivers. But in fact, I didn't. I've never been to the Murray River, but I know because either I read it online or somebody told me that it's the longest in Australia. And in some cases, actually also sentences that are self-evident could be known on the basis of testimony. So we've got to be a bit careful here. I suppose that the point here is that some sentences that are self-evident to some people might not be self-evident to other people, and the people to whom they're not self-evident might know them on grounds of testimony. So, for instance, I guess a young child who, hasn't really got to grips with mathematics yet, even basic mathematics, might not really grasp that 2 + 2 has to equal 4. They might not have the mathematical ability or background yet, but they might still believe it just because a parent has told them that it's so. So then they would believe it on testimonial grounds rather than on grounds that they're self-evident to the child. And likewise, even with us adults, maybe more complex mathematical truths, it's possible that some of them we might believe just because someone who's better at maths has told us that they're true. They might be self-evident to that person, the person who's better at maths, but not self-evident to us. So often the sorts of things that we can know on grounds of testimony are kind of similar to the sorts of things that we might know in principle by self-evidence or by more direct empirical evidence. Testimony is just a sort of another way of acquiring that sort of knowledge. And then a kind of final sort of way of knowing or coming to know or coming to get evidence for the truth of a premise might just be by means of a further argument, right? So maybe I'm interested in evaluating an argument from some premises to a conclusion, but I'm wondering, should I believe the premises? And I examine a premise and I'm like, well, why should I believe that? And maybe someone provides me with a further argument for it. Now, you might think, okay, well, we're kind of off on a regress here. So when it comes to that further argument, we might ask, well, do its premises support its conclusion? But also, what grounds do we have for believing the premises? And you might think that this sort of can't go on forever, and at some point we need premises that are justified either by self-evidence, by empirical evidence, or via testimony. Okay, so these are some ways of thinking about evidence for premises. And in the next section, we will examine testimony in particular in a bit more detail.